The package was unremarkable. Brown paper, twine, standard postage for its weight. It arrived with the morning mail delivery to Factory 333, a designation that meant nothing to the postman, but everything to the men who worked inside the sprawling, guarded compound in the Egyptian desert. It was addressed to Dr. Wolfgang Pilz, the head of the rocket program, but he was in a meeting. His secretary, a young Egyptian woman named Hannelore Wende, saw no reason for it to wait. She was efficient. Her job was to streamline the doctor's day. The package was from a university press in Germany, a familiar source for technical journals and publications. She sliced the twine with a small letter opener. Inside, a book, thick and academic. She thought nothing of it. It looked like every other technical manual that crossed her desk. She lifted the cover. The pressure release trigger, a masterpiece of malicious engineering, did its job instantly. The plastic explosive concealed within the hollowed-out book detonated with a force that atomized the desk, the mail cart, and Hannelore herself. The blast ripped through the administrative office, killing 4 other Egyptian personnel and sending a wave of shrapnel and superheated air down the corridor. For a moment, there was silence, the desert air ringing. Then, the alarms began to scream. In Tel Aviv, 250 miles away, a coded message arrived at a nondescript office building. It contained only 3 words. Delivery confirmed. Package opened. Isser Harel, the director of Mossad, read the slip of paper without expression, folded it, and placed it in an ashtray. He lit it with a cigarette, watching the corners curl to black ash. The operation, codenamed Damocles, was now fully engaged. The opening move was bloody, indiscriminate, and loud. It was designed to be. It was a message. To the German scientists building rockets for Gamal Abdel Nasser, it said, "We know where you are. We can reach you. There is no safe place." For Harel, this was not about vengeance. It was about survival. The year was 1962, and the state of Israel felt the shadow of a new existential threat. The memory of the Holocaust was not a distant historical event. It was a living wound in the nation's psyche. And now, the men who had designed the V-2 rockets that rained death on London for the Third Reich were working for an enemy sworn to Israel's destruction. This was not a problem to be managed. It was a threat to be eradicated, by any means necessary. The opening explosion at Factory 333 was not the beginning of the story, but the violent start of its final chapter. The real beginning was in the intelligence files, in the quiet, desperate calculus of a nation that believed it was fighting for its very existence. The intelligence briefing was laid out on a large table in a secure room deep within Mossad headquarters. The room was soundproof, windowless, and perpetually filled with stale cigarette smoke. At the head of the table sat Isser Harel, a man whose slight stature belied a will of iron. He was known as Isser the Little, but his ambition and ruthlessness were colossal. He had hunted Adolf Eichmann to Argentina and brought him back to face Israeli justice, a feat that had cemented Mossad's global reputation. Harel saw threats in stark, absolute terms. The German scientists in Egypt were not just engineers. They were a continuation of the final solution. Their rockets pointed at the heart of the Jewish state. His file was thick with names. The first was Professor Wolfgang Pilz. During World War II, Pilz had been a key scientist at Peenemünde, the Nazis' top-secret rocket research center, working under Werner von Braun on the V-2. After the war, he, like many of his colleagues, found his skills were in high demand. He worked for the French, then offered his services to the highest bidder. That bidder became Gamal Abdel Nasser, the charismatic and ambitious president of Egypt. Nasser saw himself as the leader of a unified Arab world, and long-range missiles were the key to challenging Israeli and Western dominance in the Middle East. Piltz was the program's technical genius, the man who could turn Nasser's dream into a terrifying reality. Next in the file was Dr. Eugen Sanger, another brilliant alumnus of the Nazi war machine. Sanger was a visionary in aerodynamics and rocketry, but his ambition was matched by his lack of scruples. He had designed the Silbervogel, a conceptual suborbital bomber for the Nazis, capable of striking New York from Germany. Now, he was lending his expertise to Cairo. Then there was Heinz Krug. Krug wasn't a top-tier scientist like Piltz or Sanger, but he was arguably more important to the immediate operation. He was the logistician, the deal-maker, the spider at the center of the web. Operating from his company, Intra, in Munich, Krug procured the sensitive materials, the specialized machine parts, and the technical components that the scientists in Egypt needed. He was the crucial link between European suppliers and Factory 333. Harrell saw him as the program's logistical linchpin. Cutting him out would cripple the entire enterprise. The geopolitical chessboard was fraught with peril. It was less than a decade after the 1956 Suez Crisis, when Israel, Britain, and France had invaded Egypt. The world was carved into Cold War spheres of influence. Nasser, while officially non-aligned, was increasingly leaning towards the Soviet bloc, which was eagerly supplying him with conventional arms. But Nasser wanted his own weapons, free from the strings of a superpower. In July 1962, Egypt test-fired its own rocket and then paraded two new models, the Al-Qahir, the Conqueror, and the Al-Zafir, the Victor, through the streets of Cairo. The world was stunned. For Israel, it was a nightmare realized. The rockets were crude, inaccurate, but they were a clear statement of intent. They could reach any city in Israel. The psychological impact was immense. The mission's genesis came from an unlikely source, a disaffected Austrian scientist working inside the Egyptian program. He approached an Israeli agent in Europe, his conscience, or perhaps his fear, getting the better of him. The information he provided was chilling. The rockets were real, and there were plans to build hundreds of them. But there was more. He claimed the Egyptians, guided by the German team, were actively working to develop non-conventional warheads. The primary plan was to arm the missiles with radioactive waste, creating a dirty bomb that would render swathes of Israeli territory uninhabitable for decades. The report also contained weaker, but still terrifying, intelligence suggesting the program was exploring chemical and biological payloads. For Harrell, this was the final confirmation. This was not merely a conventional military threat. It was a weapon of terror, a weapon of mass destruction aimed at civilians. The program had to be stopped. The diplomatic channels with West Germany were proving fruitless. Bonn claimed it was powerless to stop its citizens from working abroad, even as it publicly condemned such activities. Harrell knew diplomacy was a dead end. He convened his top lieutenants, including a young Stoic operative named Yitzhak Shamir, who would one day become Prime Minister of Israel. The order was given. Operation Damocles was to begin. The sword would be held over the heads of the German scientists. It would be an operation of fear, of intimidation, of sabotage, and, if necessary, of assassination. The rules of engagement were simple. Do whatever it takes. The list of names was no longer just an intelligence file. It had become a hit list. Mossad at that time, lacked a large-scale operational division for such a campaign. So Harel pulled in units from Shin Bet, Israel's internal security agency, to provide the necessary manpower on the ground in Europe. The war against the rocket scientists would be fought not on a battlefield, but in the shadows of European cities and the sterile workshops of a desert factory. The plan was a multi-pronged assault, a symphony of terror conducted across a continent. The first movements were quiet, almost imperceptible. In Germany, Mossad activated its network of Sayanim, local Jewish citizens willing to provide assistance. These were not spies, but helpers. They rented cars, secured apartments that became safe houses, and provided logistical support. Their ordinary lives forming the invisible infrastructure of the covert operation. An unassuming travel agency in Zurich, a small import-export business in Frankfurt. These became fronts, nodes in a network designed to move agents and equipment without a trace. The first team's objective was surveillance, using small, state-of-the-art Leica cameras, often concealed in briefcases with secret triggers. They began to document the lives of the scientists and their families in Germany. They photographed them walking their dogs, shopping for groceries, meeting with friends. Each photograph was a piece of the puzzle, building a pattern-of-life analysis. They noted vulnerabilities: a child's school route, a wife's weekly hair appointment, a favored restaurant. This information was not for assassination, not yet. It was for psychological warfare. The threats began as phone calls in the middle of the night. A voice, speaking perfect German, would say nothing more than, "Leave Egypt, go home." Then, a click. Letters began to arrive at their family homes. They contained no explicit threat, just a photograph of the scientist walking into Factory 33, or a picture of their own children playing in a park. The message was clear. "We are watching you. We are watching your family. You are never safe." In Egypt, the operational challenge was greater. Mossad needed eyes and ears on the inside. This is where Wolfgang Lotz came in, an Israeli citizen of German Jewish descent. Lotz was the perfect deep cover agent. With his fluent German, Aryan appearance and a carefully constructed backstory as a former Wehrmacht officer and wealthy horse breeder, he was tailor-made to infiltrate the expatriate German community in Cairo. He was given a new identity and a generous expense account. Known as the Champagne Spy, Lotz established an exclusive riding club near Cairo. It quickly became the favored playground for the Egyptian elite. High-ranking military officers, government officials, and crucially, the German scientists themselves. Over glasses of champagne and afternoons spent on horseback, Lotz, playing the part of a bon vivant ex-Nazi, listened. He gathered names, addresses, and details about the internal politics of the rocket program. Within months, he provided Tel Aviv with a complete list of the German contingent, their roles, and even a crucial piece of technical intelligence. The program was struggling immensely to develop a reliable guidance system. The rockets could be launched, but they couldn't be aimed with any precision. This was a critical weakness. The technology of the operation was a blend of sophisticated gadgets and brutal simplicity. The letter bombs were a key weapon. Mossad's Technical Services Division had developed a particularly nasty design. It was stable enough to withstand rough handling during postal transit, but was triggered by a pressure release mechanism. The act of pulling the letter or book from its envelope or cover was the final, fatal step that completed the circuit. It was a design that often ensured the person opening the mail, not necessarily the target, would be the victim, a fact Harel accepted as necessary collateral damage. For communication, agents used encrypted one-time pads for critical messages and shortwave radio transmitters for data dumps back to Tel Aviv. These transmissions were a known vulnerability. The case of Eli Cohen, a legendary Israeli spy captured in Syria in 1965 after his radio signals were traced, was a stark reminder of the risks. As a result, transmission protocols were strict: short bursts, irregular schedules, and frequent changes in location. But the most effective technology was often the simplest: the telephone, the camera, and the whispered word. The first major setback came from an unexpected quarter. Heinz Krug, the logistical linchpin in Munich, was growing paranoid. The late-night calls and veiled threats were working. He felt the net tightening. He was a businessman, not a soldier, and he had no desire to die for Nasser's ambitions. In early September 1962, he reached out to a man he believed could protect him. The man was a legend: Otto Skorzeny. A former SS Obersturmbannführer, Skorzeny was one of Hitler's most celebrated commandos, famous for his daring rescue of Benito Mussolini. After the war, he escaped custody and settled in Spain, a hero to neo-Nazis and a wanted man. Krug, knowing Skorzeny had connections with Egyptian intelligence, believed the famous commando could mediate a solution or offer protection. What Krug didn't know was that Mossad had already gotten to Skorzeny. In a move of breathtaking audacity and moral ambiguity, Isser Harel had decided against assassinating Skorzeny, who was high on Mossad's list of wanted Nazis. Instead, he sent a team to recruit him. The Mossad agents confronted Skorzeny at his home in Spain. The hulking Nazi commando, face to face with Israeli spies, fully expected to be killed on the spot. But the agents made him an offer: "Work for us, and we will secure your past." Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter, would be persuaded to remove Skorzeny's name from his lists. In exchange, Skorzeny would provide intelligence on the scientists and, when asked, would act as an instrument of Mossad policy. Trapped, and likely seeing a path to his own form of absolution and security, Skorzeny agreed. He became Mossad's most shocking asset. So when Heinz Krug called Skorzeny for help, he was walking into the lion's den. Skorzeny agreed to meet him. On September 11, 1962, Heinz Krug told his office he was leaving for a meeting. He was never seen again. The second major complication unfolded in Cairo. Wolfgang Lotz, the Champagne spy, continued to feed a steady stream of high-value intelligence back to Tel Aviv. He had identified the key figures, mapped their social networks, and even planted listening devices in key locations. But his luck was about to run out. The Egyptians, aided by Soviet technical advisors and chastened by the recent capture of Israel's spy Eli Cohen in Damascus through similar methods, had upgraded their radio counterintelligence capabilities. They began a systematic sweep of Cairo using new, sensitive direction-finding equipment. In February 1965, Lotz's transmissions were detected. A team of Egyptian security police stormed his apartment. They found the transmitter hidden in a bathroom scale. Lotz, caught red-handed, knew the game was up. His primary concern, as Mossad had always feared, was for his wife, Waltraud, who was with him and knew of his activities. Thinking fast, Lotz confessed, but only to a version of the truth. He stuck to his cover story. He claimed he was a German citizen, a former Wehrmacht officer, who had been blackmailed and enticed with money by Israeli intelligence to spy for them. He gambled that the Egyptians would see him as a mercenary, not a dedicated Israeli agent. The gamble paid off. The Egyptians, believing his story, sentenced him to life in prison for espionage, rather than executing him as a Zionist enemy. While the loss of their top agent in Cairo was a severe blow, the fact that his true identity as an Israeli officer remained secret was a small victory, a testament to the strength of his cover. The operation was now partially blind in Egypt, and Harel was forced to escalate the campaign in Europe. The pressure on the remaining scientists intensified. The threats became more explicit. One scientist's daughter was approached by a stranger who told her to tell her father that if he didn't quit his job in Egypt, he would be returned to his family in a wooden box. The psychological war was entering its most brutal phase. The climax of the operation was not a single, explosive event, but a cold, calculated act of murder in the Bavarian countryside. 10:15 p.m., September 11th, 1962. Heinz Krug drives his white Mercedes to a prearranged meeting point in a forest outside Munich. He is nervous, but he believes he is meeting his protector, Otto Skorzeny. The location is remote, chosen by Skorzeny for its privacy. 10:28 p.m. Krug arrives. A car is already waiting. Skorzeny is there as promised, but he is not alone. Two other men are with him, their faces impassive. They are introduced as friends. They are in fact members of a Mossad Kidon unit, the elite assassination squad. Krug's relief at seeing Skorzeny is short-lived. A sense of dread begins to creep in. 10:31 p.m. The trap is sprung. Before Krug can react, he is overpowered, bundled into the back of the waiting car. The movement is swift, brutal, and efficient. There is no struggle. His mouth is taped shut. The forest is silent again. 10:45 p.m. The car speeds away from the meeting point. Krug's Mercedes is left behind, to be found by police days later, sparking a missing person investigation. The Mossad car drives to a safe house on the outskirts of the city. 11:50 p.m. Krug is taken from the car and led into the basement of the safe house. Yitzhak Shamir is present, overseeing the final act. Krug is subjected to a harsh interrogation. He is a terrified businessman, not a hardened spy. He quickly tells them everything he knows: supplier lists, shipping routes, bank accounts, the names of other collaborators within European companies. He gives them the entire logistical blueprint of the Egyptian rocket program. Sometime before dawn, after the interrogation is complete, the sentence is carried out. According to some reports, Otto Skorzeny, the Nazi war hero turned Mossad asset, fires the single shot that kills Heinz Krug. It is the ultimate act of his twisted pact with the Israeli Secret Service. The body does not need to be hidden. It needs to vanish. The Mossad team, along with Skorzeny, drive the body deep into a secluded part of the forest. There, they douse it in acid. What remains is buried. Heinz Krug is erased. There is no body, no evidence, just a man who disappeared. The message to the other scientists was not shouted, but it was heard with chilling clarity. This was no longer a game of threats and intimidation. The rules had changed. People could simply vanish without a trace, their fates forever a mystery. Fear, cold and absolute, began to spread through the German scientific community in Egypt. The disappearance of their key logistics man in Munich crippled the project's supply chain, but the psychological impact was far more devastating. The immediate fallout was precisely what Harel had intended. The murder of Heinz Krug sent a shockwave through the remaining scientists. The supply chain he managed was thrown into chaos, but the psychological effect was the real victory. One by one, the German engineers and technicians began to pack their bags. The late-night phone calls and threatening letters, once seen as mere harassment, were now understood as deadly promises. The allure of Nasser's money and the challenge of the project faded against the stark, primal fear of being the next to disappear. By the end of 1963, the combination of Mossad's relentless intimidation campaign and quiet diplomatic pressure from a now embarrassed West German government had achieved its goal. The vast majority of the German scientists had abandoned Factory 333 and returned to Europe. Deprived of its foreign expertise, Egypt's ambitious rocket program withered and died. The production lines ground to a halt. The dream of an Egyptian-made missile capable of striking Tel Aviv was over. Nasser was forced to turn to the Soviet Union, which eventually supplied him with Scud missiles, a move that brought Egypt more firmly into the Soviet orbit, a geopolitical consequence that had its own complex repercussions. But Operation Damocles came at a high price for Mossad. The campaign, particularly the use of letter bombs that injured civilians and the blatant operations on Swiss and German soil, caused a major diplomatic firestorm. Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, a man who understood the necessity of ruthless action, but also the importance of international standing, was furious with Harel. He believed his spy chief had gone too far, endangering Israel's fragile relationship with West Germany and risking global condemnation. In March 1963, Ben-Gurion demanded and received Yasser Harel's resignation. The architect of the Eichmann capture and the man who had stopped Nasser's rocket program was forced from the agency he had built into a formidable global force. The final, astonishing twist of the story would not become public for decades, a secret buried deep in the archives of Israeli intelligence. The key to the operation's most decisive moment, the elimination of Heinz Krug, was not an Israeli hero, but one of the Third Reich's most infamous commandos. Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite commando, had not only worked for Mossad, but had acted as a contract killer for the Jewish state. His deal was honored. His name was quietly scrubbed from watch lists, and he was allowed to live out his days in comfortable retirement in Spain, dying of cancer in 1975. The story of Operation Damocles is therefore a story of brutal pragmatism. It reveals a moment in history when the Israeli intelligence service decided that, to fight monsters, it needed to hire a monster of its own. It was a dark alliance, a deal with the devil made in the shadows of the Cold War, a chilling testament to the lengths a nation will go to when it believes its survival is at stake. The rockets were stopped, but the moral compromises made in the process left an indelible stain, a stark reminder that in the world of espionage, victory and virtue are rarely found in the same place.